20,000 feet above Europe, the sky burned with fire and steel. A young American pilot gripped the controls of his P-51 Mustang, heart pounding in rhythm with the engine. Smoke streaked across the horizon, tracer rounds slicing through the air. He banked left, then right, hunting the enemy that had just torn through his formation. Then he saw it, a German Messerschmitt, crippled, trailing smoke, desperately trying to reach home. His thumb hovered over the trigger. One squeeze, and it would all be over. But in that frozen heartbeat, he saw something. Not an enemy, not a target, but a man, terrified, alone, and beaten. He lifted his hand off the trigger. The guns fell silent. He saluted. And in return, the German nodded. The war continued. The mission ended. But for that pilot, the moment never did. Decades later, long after the medals were boxed away and the skies had quieted, a letter arrived, with a name he thought he'd never see again. A letter that would reopen a memory and heal a wound history forgot. His name was Charlie Brown, a 22-year-old farm boy from Weston, West Virginia. Before the war, he had never been more than a few hundred feet off the ground. He joined the Army Air Forces in 1943. Young, idealistic, barely old enough to rent a car back home. But in the air, over Europe, youth didn't matter. Training didn't matter. Only survival did. It was December 20th, 1943, the day of their first mission over Germany. The target? Bremen. Factories, assembly lines, and the heart of the Luftwaffe's production network. Brown's crew flew a B-17 they'd named Ye Olde Pub. A sturdy bird, proud and new, with her 4 engines gleaming under the morning frost. 10 men climbed aboard that day, laughing, nervous, all pretending not to notice how pale the other looked. They had trained together for months, but nothing could prepare them for what waited over Bremen. At first, it went as planned. The bombers climbed through a ceiling of cloud, engines roaring in unison, the rising sun flashing across their silver bellies. Above the radio chatter and engine hum, there was a strange beauty to it, the illusion of control. Then, everything changed. Flak erupted from the ground, black clouds of death blooming all around them. The air shuddered. Ye Olde Pub jolted violently as shrapnel tore through her belly. One engine burst into flames. The tail gunner screamed through the intercom, hit but still firing. The bombardier was bleeding. The navigator slumped over his charts. Within minutes, they fell out of formation, the worst place a bomber could ever be. Alone. Brown gritted his teeth, fighting the controls. His gloves were slick with sweat and blood. The horizon tilted as the aircraft struggled to stay level. He could barely hear himself think over the shriek of wind through bullet holes in the fuselage. Then came the final blow. A swarm of Messerschmitts, a dozen at least, descended like wolves. Tracers ripped through the wings, glass shattered, engines sputtered. The crew fought back with what guns still worked, but their firepower was fading fast. One by one, the German fighters peeled away, until only one remained. That last Messerschmitt was flown by Franz Stiegler, a seasoned Luftwaffe pilot with more than 24 victories to his name. He had already been ordered to shoot down any crippled enemy aircraft that tried to limp home, and if he did, he would earn the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest honor for valor. He took off from his base in pursuit, following the trail of black smoke cutting through the winter sky. When he finally caught sight of the American bomber, he steadied his breathing, ready for the kill. But what he saw instead made his finger freeze on the trigger. The B-17 was torn open like a can. One tailgun hung uselessly from its mount. Blood streaked the fuselage. Through the shattered glass nose, Stiegler could see the pilot, young, pale, barely, conscious, still trying to hold the aircraft together. He edged closer, curious, and what he saw next would stay with him forever. A crewman, missing his helmet, blood soaking his uniform, tending to another who lay motionless. The bomber was defenseless. The gunners were dead or too wounded to fight. There was no glory left here, no battle, no enemy, just broken men trying to get home. Franz lowered his hand, The engine of his Messerschmitt roared as he pulled up beside the B-17 just feet away. He locked eyes with the American pilot through the canopy. Brown flinched at first, expecting the burst that would finish them, but it never came. Instead, the German gestured, pointing west, signaling toward Sweden. Brown didn't understand. His crew was barely conscious. He couldn't hear the message, but he felt it. Mercy. For nearly 10 minutes the two planes flew side by side, enemies, yet not. Stigler refused to leave them until they were clear of the German coast. He knew that if anyone saw him escorting a bomber out of enemy airspace, he would face a firing squad for treason. But he stayed. As the B-17 crossed into the North Sea, Stigler saluted, a small, silent gesture that said everything words couldn't. Brown, bleeding and dazed, raised his hand in return. Then the German rolled his fighter, turned back toward Germany, and disappeared into the clouds. The ye old pub barely made it home. Brown and his surviving crew crash-landed in England. Doctors said it was a miracle anyone was still alive. When debriefed, Charlie told his commanders the truth, that a German pilot had spared them. The officer in charge looked him straight in the eye and said, "Lieutenant, don't ever repeat that story again." It didn't fit the narrative. Mercy didn't win wars. So he stayed silent. The war ended. The years passed. Brown left the Air Force, married, raised a family. He worked as an engineer, went to church on Sundays, lived an ordinary life. But some nights, when the wind rattled the windows, he would see the Messerschmitt again, the gray sky, the salute, the mercy. He'd whisper a silent prayer for the man he never met again, and then, 40 years later, that letter arrived. Inside were the words that ended 4 decades of wondering. The man who didn't shoot, the man he had saluted in that frozen sky, had found him. 40 years, 4 decades of silence between two men who shared a sky of fire. Charlie Brown was in his 60s when the letter came, retired, graying, living a quiet life in Florida. He'd long since stopped talking about the war. He'd told the story only once, to his wife, decades before, then buried it in the attic of memory. But when the mailman handed him that envelope, something stirred, a ghost, long forgotten, now knocking at his door. It was small, plain, postmarked from Canada. He almost threw it aside, but the handwriting, sharp, deliberate, caught his eye. He tore it open. Inside was a single page, written in careful English. "Dear Mr. Brown, you will not remember me, but I remember you. I was the one who did not shoot you down over Germany that day. For 40 years I have wondered if you made it home. Now I know." Charlie froze. The air left his lungs. The room tilted, blurred, and the years collapsed all at once. That sky, the gray clouds, the blood, the smoke, all of it came rushing back. He read it again, slower this time, hands trembling. Attached to the letter was a faded black and white photograph. A man in his 70s, white-haired, standing proudly beside a restored Messerschmitt fighter. The caption read, "Franz Stigler." Charlie sank into his chair. His eyes welled up. For years he had prayed that the man he spared had survived. He'd imagined him lost to history, just another pilot swallowed by the war. But here he was, alive, old, and reaching across time to finish a story neither of them could forget. He wrote back immediately, "You are the reason I'm alive. I have wanted to thank you my entire life." Over the next few weeks, letters turned into phone calls. The voices were older now, heavier with years, but familiar in spirit. They spoke about that day, the mission, the moment when two enemies had looked at each other and seen something deeper than flags or uniforms. Franz told him what had happened after. He had landed, shaken, unsure what to tell his commander. Had anyone seen? He lied in his report, said he had run out of ammunition. He was never awarded the Knight's Cross. And he never regretted it. He left Germany after the war, disillusioned, broken by what he'd seen. He built a new life in Canada, carrying that secret like a hidden scar. For decades he'd searched military archives, hoping to find the crew of Ye Olde pub. But the war had erased so many names, and Brown's wasn't easy to trace. Until, one day, a veterans magazine carried a short article, seeking the pilot who showed mercy over Germany. Charlie Brown had written it. It was the last piece of the puzzle. The story had come full circle. In 1990, they finally met, at a small airfield in Washington state. The world had turned gray and quiet by then, but that day the sky was blue again. When Franz stepped off the plane, Charlie was already waiting, stiff-backed, nervous, his heart racing like it did that night over Bremen. He didn't know what to say. How do you thank a man for your life? For 40 years of everything, family, peace, children, that he made possible? They saw each other across the tarmac. For a moment, neither moved. Then, slowly, they approached. Franz raised his hand in salute, just as he had in 1943. Charlie did the same, and when their hands dropped, they embraced. No words, just silence, the kind that says more than any language can. Around them, the world blurred, reporters, cameras, family, all fading into nothing. Two old soldiers, enemies once, now bound by a memory stronger than war. They spent the next years inseparable, visiting schools, reunions, air shows, telling their story. They wanted young people to understand. Even in humanity's darkest hour, compassion still existed. Franz would say, "Charlie was my brother, the best friend I ever had." Charlie called him the man who gave me back my faith in mankind. When Franz died in 2008 at the age of 92, Charlie spoke at his memorial. He looked out over the crowd, pilots, veterans, families, and said softly, "My brother has gone home." 2 months later, Charlie passed away as well. Their ashes, it said, were carried by the same wind, the one that had once borne them through battle, now guiding them both home. Pause. Sound of distant engines fades out, replaced by a quiet heartbeat. 40 years of silence ended with a single letter, and one impossible friendship proved that mercy is the one thing war can never kill. There's a strange truth about war. It teaches men to see the world in absolutes. Friend and foe, victory and defeat, life and death. But sometimes in the space between those absolutes, humanity slips through, quiet, fragile, defiant. Charlie Brown and Franz Stiegler lived in that space, and for one frozen moment above Germany, they proved that mercy could exist, even when the world had forgotten what it meant. After their reunion, both men spent their final years together, not as soldiers, not as veterans, but as brothers. They called each other almost every day. They visited schools and air museums, telling their story to anyone who would listen. When asked why he spared the bomber, Franz would pause, smile faintly, and say, "There's no honor in killing a man who cannot fight back." Charlie would nod, eyes distant, still seeing that gray sky. "I think God sent him," he once said quietly. "I think God sent him to show me what grace looks like." They both knew how rare their story was, how fragile the thread that connected them had been. 1 second of hesitation either way, and the outcome would have vanished into smoke. History would have lost it. And yet here it was, two enemies who turned a moment of violence into one of the purest acts of humanity ever recorded in war. Soft archival sounds, typewriter keys is more than friendship. It captures forgiveness. It captures the idea that we are never defined solely by the flags we fight under, but by the hearts we carry inside our uniforms. When Franz died, his ashes were scattered over the Pacific Northwest, the same sky he'd crossed countless times, with Charlie by his side. When Charlie passed 2 months later, his family said it felt like Franz had simply called him home. Even in death, they couldn't be separated. Soft wind fades, just the piano now. War stories often end with numbers, body counts, medals, losses, victories. But this one ends with something else entirely. It ends with a letter, a handshake, a choice. It ends with proof that even in the darkest storms of human history, compassion can still cut through like sunlight through smoke. Maybe that's why their story endures, not because it's about war, but because it's about what survived it. Pause. Music quiets to a single sustained note. In a world built on vengeance, Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler reminded us that mercy is the highest form of courage, and that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is simply not pull the trigger. In the end, Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler's story wasn't about war. It was about what survived it. Radio static, distant engine noise. When people heard their story for the first time, many couldn't believe it. A German ace sparing an American bomber? It sounded like myth, a fairy tale born from nostalgia. But it wasn't. It was real. Every document, every flight record, every piece of that day was confirmed. Even the bullet holes on Ye Olde pub matched Franz's description exactly. That's what made it so powerful, because it reminded us that history is not just made by the victors or written in medals. It's carried in the small, silent choices no one sees. The ones made when no one's watching, when there's nothing to gain and everything to lose. Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler never thought of themselves as heroes. To them, they simply did what conscience demanded, and maybe that's what true heroism really is, the courage to act human when everything around you insists you shouldn't. Music swells slightly. A low cello enters. There's a photo, taken late in their lives. The two of them sitting side by side in folding chairs at an air show, the crowd blurred behind them. Charlie's laughing. Franz is watching him, smiling. His pilot's cap tilted slightly. Two old men, once enemies, now family. That photo captured two men who should have been enemies instead, proved that compassion can outlast hatred and mercy can echo louder than gunfire. Their meeting in the skies above Germany reminds us that even when the world is at its worst, humanity can still rise above the smoke. If stories like this move you, stay with us. Subscribe and help keep alive the forgotten moments of courage and kindness that history almost lost. Because somewhere out there, another story like this is waiting to be remembered.